Well, it's another book lunch. Welcome to book lunch of Journey of an Aesthete podcast, and that's our theme song. And we're going to commence with this episode, our very first episode, with a multi-episode examination of Hannah Arendt's Life of the Mind. And this is an unfinished work, and she was working on, well, I'll let Mary McCarthy talk to you about in her editor's commentary in a minute about the story of this. But anyhow, it was going to be 3 volumes, Thinking, Willing, and Judging, and we don't have Judging. We only have volumes 1 and 2, Thinking and Willing. And I'm going to stick today to the text, to words on a page in a book, an object with volume and mass that takes up a little bit of space. And I have a kind of a motley situation because I have 2 different editions for both volumes. I've got a really threadbare used edition for volume 1, Thinking. And it's gone through many hands of college students, PhD students. It's a first edition from 1977, I think, or 76. And then I have a really nice, with the copy still, photograph and a good jacket on it of the Willing. And so we're going to go look at those 2 things. And so I'm going to go over to the chair here, of course. And so to get comfortable and get familiar with what we're going to do. This is an extraordinary, I should say, immediately, that, I could have chosen a lot of texts from Hannah Arendt. I could have done, for example, Origins of Totalitarianism is the one that's most read today, because people are so moved to read that given current events, or feel that they should be reading that to given the current events. There's a little book, paperback book by Richard Bernstein called Why Read Hannah Arendt Now? And this probably came out maybe 2010, 11, somewhere in there. Over the past few years, I've been a fan of and student of the Hannah Arendt Center from Roger Berkowitz, and they've been doing seasonal treatments of her, or examinations of her books, like The Human Condition, for example, or Men in Dark Times, her Jewish writings. All of those are great. Eichmann in Jerusalem. So I could have chosen one of those texts, but I chose Life of the Mind for several reasons. It's her last work. It's unfinished, which is interesting. It's incomplete, so it'll only have 2 volumes. And it does feel, in a large extent, a summing up of her ideas. I mean, of course, it's her last text, and part of that could be related to that. But also, it's her, try to choose my words carefully. It's unlike those other books I just mentioned. It's not a work necessarily of persuasion, or it doesn't deal always necessarily with what we would call controversial, topical, contentious themes, like, say, the Holocaust or the Shoah. That comes up, of course, immediately, as we'll get to in a few minutes, because that's, it isn't that it's not present, but she's dealing with much larger issues, namely what it is to be human, right? So it's the theme of our podcast. So what is thinking? And as we'll find out, she has an extremely unusual, unique, innovative, idiosyncratic definition of thinking itself. It is contrary to most definitions that many of us, or most people hold today, especially our neuroscientists and psychologists and therapists. Those 3 groups would not agree with a lot of this. It's contrary. So Hannah Arendt. So Hannah Arendt is the flag waving champion of, for lack of a better formulation, the continental school. For her, largely German. And this, of course, is still to this day at great odds with Anglo-American philosophy. In almost every respect. I recently did last year I did a program on Isaiah Berlin and Hannah Arendt, and a great deal of the rift between them and disagreement and all sorts of things is really a disagreement of these two dominant schools of philosophic thinking. And I'm only mentioning all this because as we go through this text, you're going to see a lot of snide remarks from her about British thinkers, especially the scientific-minded or positivistic. Positivism is not positive thinking. It's a school of philosophy that was extremely wanted to make philosophy into a hard science and a matter of logical, Carnap is a name in that. A.J. Ayer. There's also Oxford philosophy. And so that was what was going on when Isaiah Berlin was being trained in the 30s and 40s and 50s. And that's a totally different milieu, and it's a different mindset. And she's aware of that stuff, but she's firmly in the camp of what we would call continental. And there's a lot of interesting things around that. So as we go through this text, I'm going to use an approach that's called close reading. So what is close reading? So close reading is, like it says, it's almost tautologous. It's like, you look at the sentences and paragraphs, and it's actually slow reading. And so I didn't really know quite how to proceed with this series because there's so many possibilities. I could have done a traditional close reading, in which case this would be 12 episodes. It would take us in through the summer of this one text because we would be reading that closely of all the sentences. I scrapped that. Of course, I was never going to do that, but of course that's one. So I'm going to do an alternative close reading that's a little more, it's still going to be very close, but a little less detailed than that. And also I'm going to be coming from my own point of view, which is not the point of view of, say, Richard Bernstein or even the Jerome Kahn. I mean, these people, her colleagues and all that at that time, because we're going to try to read Life of the Mind as an artistic work, even though it's a work of explicit nonfiction, philosophical speculation, and not non-fictional. We're going to read it as an aesthetic object, which is interesting. We'll see how that goes. And there's a lot of things that follow from that, as we'll see. So I'm going to start off with this. This is my old threadbare edition here, and this is the good condition. This is Hannah Arendt around the time she wrote this. And so one of Hannah Arendt's greatest friends was Mary McCarthy, the writer. And she edited a lot of these texts, and she did a lot of the work on Life of the Mind. And so we're going to hear now from Mary McCarthy's postscript. So we're going to go to the end of this volume, very end, and read some of the postface. And just to give us a sense of, historical context and all that stuff people can get excited about or think is very important. I think it's important too, but perhaps less important than many do, because we're going to get inside the text and sort of slightly put at a distance worldly things like whatever she thought about, about anything, about the polis or about liberal democracy and all that. And so this is what Mary McCarthy says. She says here, I've also got I've changed coffee cups for this series. Here we go. Think, because we're talking about thinking and we're reading a book about thinking. And this is Think Coffee, so I have some of this here. Today, we're not going to have any images or film clips. We will in the future. We're going to deal with Mary McCarthy to some extent. We're going to deal with Margaret von Trotte's Hannah Arendt, which is about a 9-year-old film. I'm going to show clips from that to give kind of an imaginative, dramatic rendering of some of these things that occurred. So let's get to Mary McCarthy first, and then we'll do some of the first pages. Says here, Mary McCarthy writes, Hannah Arendt died suddenly on December 4th, 1975. Okay. It was a Thursday evening, and she was entertaining friends. The Saturday before she had finished Willing, the second section of The Life of the Mind. So this is a deathbed book. So she dies on Thursday, and just the very week before she finished this complete. And so now what Mary McCarthy has to do is to go through all this and so on. So I'm going to get my glasses here. I'm very excited about this series because it's a real honor, and I have a lot of gratitude for her having written this, because we can do this now. But also, it's a real pleasure to do close reading. Now, on this podcast, I've done close reading with everything, with music, with guests on episodes. I'm using a lot of these principles, so I've never really done anything other than that, really. But it's a very, close reading is a very flexible thing for me. I can stretch it and move it around. Doesn't necessarily mean one thing, but there are some non-negotiable principles, like close attention and staying with the text, whether it's a piece of music, whether it's an acting performance, whether it's a movie clip, whether it's a Nick Rogue film, whether it's an episode of Girls. And so if we're doing an episode of Girls and Soshi Mamet is doing her speak, her language and her fast-paced, that is important. We would focus on one of her turns, verbal pyrotechnics that she does. And that would actually be more important if we were doing, say, that show. It would be much more important than many other considerations, because after all, audiences are focusing on that. I mean, they may also be focusing on the room that she's in, or what Ray says or thinks, or other characters and all that, of course. But I think criticism and artistic appreciation takes a wrong turn when it abandons that and talks about what I would call less important things and less important matters. So we're going to deal with the sentences and the paragraphs in this. So back to Mary McCarthy. Just going to give us context to where Life of the Mind comes from. I mean, the book, not the life of our minds, right? Like the human condition, its forerunner, the work was conceived in 3 parts, where the human condition, subtitled the Vita Activa, that was one of Arendt's favorite phrases, Viva Activa, had been divided into labor. These words, by the way, these words are capitalized. It's very continental, Germanic, French, like capitalizing justice or capitalizing, capitalizing concepts, So labor, work, and action. Those are the 3 parts of the human condition. Those are all capitalized, and those are all distinct from one another. The life of the mind as planned was divided into, again, thinking, willing, and judging, the 3 basic activities as she saw it of mental life. I'm going to skip around here a little bit. That's why it's not a traditional close reading. We're not going to spend 2 hours on this editor's postface. We're just going to spend a few minutes. She says, whether or not the life of the mind is superior to the so-called active life, as antiquity and the Middle Ages had considered, was an issue she never pronounced on in so many words. Yet it would not be too much to say that the last years of her life were consecrated to this work, which she treated as a task laid on her as a vigorously thinking being, which she treated as a thinking being, the highest she had been called to. So that's another reason why we're choosing this book. That attitude that Mary McCarthy's expressing about her friend and intellectual colleague, that this is the highest, this is actually, in that some sense, maybe more important. They're all great books, but this might be the most important, possibly. And so that was another consideration, aside from the fact that it's not a specific issue like dictatorship, totalitarianism, Stalinism, Nazism, etc., political philosophy. So the highest calling for her, the highest she'd been called to, right? In the midst of her multifarious teaching and lecture commitments, her service on various roundtables and panels and consultative boards, she was a constant recruit to the vita activa of the citizen and the public figure, though seldom a volunteer. She remained immersed in the life of the mind, as though its completion would acquit her, not so much of an obligation, which sounds too onerous, as of a compact she had entered into. All roads, however secondary, on which chance or intention put her in daily and professional existence, led back to that. I'm going to make a little comment on Mary McCarthy's prose now. She's such a good writer, and this is a good, this is not, we're not reading The Group, we're not reading the Stones of Florence or one of her other works, or her new, her book on the Groves of Academe and all these the Man in the Books Brothers shirt, all these wonderful, wonderful works of the 20th century. We're just, this is just a postface, and yeah, it's an example here. It says she remains immersed in the life of the mind as though its completion would acquit her, not so much of an obligation, which sounds too onerous, as of a compact she had entered into. So it's sort of like, this is the thing in prose, it's like what she's doing. It's sort of like A, it's not B, which means it's not, she's trying to find, and you'll, as we'll see, Hannah Arendt, even though she's writing not in German but in English, is dealing with syntax in a similar way, of sort of this kind of, this is gonna come up over and over and over again in this series, a searching quality rather than a conclusive quality, if I could put it that way. And then it goes on to say that Hannah Arendt was doing the Gifford lectures at the University of Aberdeen. And the Gifford lectures were really important, I think, or famous, named after Adam Gifford, who was a Scottish lord, I think judge or law lord. Edinburgh, Glasgow, Aberdeen, St. Andrews, natural theology. But here are some of the names. So it gives you an idea of the company that they considered. And this is in a very chauvinistic period of time. We're talking about the 50s, 60s, and 70s, and yet. Okay. They consider Hannah Arendt in the company of William James, Henri Bergson, Alfred North Whitehead, John Dewey, Karl Barth, Gabriel Marcel. It was a roll call. She's along in the company of such folks. So that's kind of the thing. And then she's teaching it says she's teaching at the New School for Social Research in New York. As she told friends, she counted on judgment to be much shorter than the other two. She also used to say that she expected it to be the easiest to handle. The hardest had been the will. That is the hardest to write, The reason she gave her kind on judgment to be short was the lack of source material. Only Kant had written on the faculty, which before him had been unnoticed by philosophers except in the field of aesthetics, where it had been named taste. So this is really interesting because before we started, or society started using the word aesthetic, they would often use the word taste. And I'm not saying they're an exact synonym, but there's a relationship there. And then we'd have to go through a whole history in this. We'd have to read, oh goodness, Berkeley and Hume and Kant especially, the concept of the sublime or sublimity, right? The cultivation of taste, and this idea of sort of when we experience the world, we're always experiencing, as Bernard Williams, my favorite English philosopher, tells us, we're always experiencing the world from a point of view. We're never experiencing an omniscient perspective. We may tell ourselves we are, we may say metaphysically, oh, I know what no, we're lying, self-deception. We're not, none of us are ever doing that. There's always, it's always being colored by this chair, this moment, and that's a theme in this book too, And so that's kind of a thing we're going to get into. So I just wanted to go over some Mary McCarthy a little bit. And she worked very hard on this. And then there's a lot of discussion about the word Englishing. I think Hannah Arendt used to use the word to Mary McCarthy in conversation. I have to do some Englishing now, which is sort of a word, a neologism I think she created to describe thinking in English, Englishing. And there's a lot of discussions of ending in sense with prepositions, which Mary McCarthy was a big fan of doing that. She does it in her own text. No problem. Discussor Jerome Cohn, William Shawn, who was her editor in New Yorker, or Wally Shawn, the actor's father, I believe. That's interesting. Was Hannah Arendt's editor on Origins of Totalitarianism. Eichmann in Jerusalem. And Mary McCarthy goes on to say, this was really I think Mary McCarthy, reading between the lines here, really relished working on this because it was connecting her with her education. Now, the education of Mary McCarthy and Hannah Arendt was simply extraordinary. These were two women that not only read everything, but they read everything of value. And in Mary McCarthy's case, it's a consequence of having a certain kind of Catholic education, being a good Irish Catholic that she was. And she wrote about that, Memories of a Catholic Girlhood. I highly recommend that book as well. Losing her faith and all that, and break from the church and all that. But in Hannah Arendt's case, it's just, a lot of it was the culture she was reared in, and the Jewish culture of those very early 20th century Jewish culture, like 1920s, 30s, up into the and so there's a sense in which they kind of connected, I think, as friends because they had a shared language, shared cultural reference points, touchstones. And so, as an example, in this passage, he says, Master Eckhart, right? So I had to go back and read Master Eckhart. Definitions of love, definitions of willing. She says, I apologize to the general reader, Mary McCarthy does, for mentioning these details of footnotes, capitalization, brackets, and so on, as devoid of interest to an outsider as a sportsman's pondered choice of trout fly when a worm will catch the fish. That the fish is the point tends to be lost sight of by specialists. As Hannah Arendt would be the first to agree. Hannah Arendt cared for the general reader, who for her remained a student in adult form. That's what I am. I'm a student in adult form, and I'm a general reader. And that's interesting. So it's, again, the point of view of Hannah Arendt, like Isaiah Berlin and like sometimes Bernard Williams, sometimes people we've had on our show, Robert Pippin, Elizabeth Anderson, has one eye focused on the general reader. So she's writing something that's very learned and lofty, sometimes difficult, but never so difficult that it's not always accessible, given some effort, approachable, and general. And this gets into a whole long issue of those years, which were all what I call water cooler years. You know, the metaphor of like people meeting and say, well, what do you think about, what do you think about what happened this September in Munich, in 73? Isn't that awful? Or Nixon and Watergate, do you think Nixon's lying? People get gathering around a water cooler, and talking about hot button issues or any issues of the day, or neutral issues like the weather. If the weather, I'm sure then it was much more neutral than it is now, of course. But, I'm just saying that's kind of that idea of, Walter Cronkite and Peter Jennings, you get this, that's kind of the generalism, generalist as opposed to specialist, specialization, generalization. Of course, it has different meanings, but I guess kind of riffing on that. She cared for the general reader. That was why she especially loved Socrates. So Hannah Arendt believed in the general reader, and she loved Socrates because I guess Socrates also had maybe not just one eye, but two eyes on a general reader, or on his interlocutors, of which there were many, as we know, right? So that's the postface. Now we're going to go all the way back to the beginning of the book. And we're going to go to the introduction. Now, we're not going to get out of the introduction today. Sorry, we're just not. There's a lot to it. This introduction, she's sort of laying the groundwork for what she's going to do, which is what nonfiction authors do in this kind of text. They're saying, well, this is why we're doing this. This is why it matters. If I'm not doing this, if I'm not going to do something, this is why I'm not going to do it. These are just, I'm thinking at the top of my head, right? If I'm going to spend this much time on something, this is why this much time. If I leave this to the side, this is why I've left that to the side. Many reasons, right? That kind of stuff, sort of. So, we're going to be thrust headlong into one of the worst events of the 20th century immediately. That was her impetus. So her impetus, of course, I don't know people's familiarity with the Eichmann trial and Eichmann in Jerusalem, but she covered the trial for the New Yorker. And I saw the play, The Man in the Glass Box. Is that Robert Shaw? So I saw the Donald Pleasance production in the 70s. Donald Pleasance, when he wasn't doing B horror movies, and thrillers and all that, he was serious acting, right? And I think Robert Shaw, of course, was known as in Jaws as actually also as a playwright. And that was a play about the Eichmann trial, in Israel at that time in 62, 63. And so that was very much covered, and I saw that play as a child. Anyhow, so she explains herself here. What disturbs me is that I try my hand at it, for I have neither claim nor ambition to be a philosopher. Now, I covered this in the previous episode where I said, who belong a club, who would Groucho Marx, would you want to belong a club that have you as a member? Just like I'm not good enough to be a philosopher, or does she mean philosophers? I don't want to be in their camp. There are people I don't like Carnap and Ayer and these sort of uncultivated, Philistine, positivistic, scientistic, English folks who don't talk about real. I'm caricaturing Arendt's point of view now, just riffing. Don't want to, talk about really serious things like beauty, truth, justice, equality. They're going on and on about language in their Oxford drawing rooms, common rooms, in Oxford, and this kind of thing. She's saying, in that sense, it's good that she's not a philosopher, because if that's what a philosopher is, right. Having fun with this now. So the answer will have to show what prompted me to venture from the relatively safe fields of political science and theory into these rather awesome matters instead of leaving well enough alone. So we're going to do some closing. So she's saying that the field of political science was safe for her. She called it safe because in 1973 or two, with all of the tumult and the Weather Underground and SDS and the Soviet Union and the Cold War and on, the hippie revolt and Watergate and Vietnam, with all that, from her point of view, that was kind of safe to be in poli-sci or political theory. Isn't that interesting? I mean, again, it's her perspective. Factually, my preoccupation with mental activities has two rather different origins. The immediate impulse came from my attending the Eichmann trial in Jerusalem. In my report of it, I spoke of, drum roll, the banality of evil. And this is the famous, people who have not read anything, semi-educated, semi-literate people will probably in a Jeopardy type quiz will say, what did Hannah Arendt say? She said the banality of evil. Actually, the subtitle of Eichmann in Jerusalem is a report. Let me find it here. Report on the banality of evil. Here. Yeah. A report. So it's a report. Now, I should say, again, to bring things that need to be brought into this text, that we know now that Hannah Arendt was not totally accurate about Eichmann. We know, we know that. So I'm just sort of staving off possible controversies. But there's a separate question. So what I want to say as we read her text, that she, even though she was wrong about specifics, she was deeply accurate about aspects of him, aspects of Nazism, and the question of evil itself. Aspects of, not the, and she's very clear. She's a good, so already in this book, she's going to say, well, what kind of evil are we talking about? Are we talking about sort of sinister delight in hurting others and sadism? The monster? And that's kind of what she's saying, well, there's something else. There's the question of being superfluous as a human or unnecessary. And that really should hit home to us today in 2024 with AI coming in. So there's a kind of evil that comes from the human feeling that they don't matter, nobody loves or cares about them. That can cause evil too, but that's a rather different cause, isn't it, than a psychopathic sadist that gets off on torturing. They're very different, but yet the results may look identical or might in fact be identical. So she was always so. I only bring this up because one of Hannah Arendt's political themes in all of her writing is her concern about the dangers of what I say, people feeling unneeded and unimportant, or not, lack of recognition. And that's a theme. Again, we're in a world now where there's all kinds of the question of identity and recognized. Who am I? Do I matter to somebody? That's she's recognizing that's a basic need. And if you take that away, as she felt happened in both the Soviet Union, all the Soviet satellite states, including the so-called good countries, they're not good to me, but I won't get into, anything influenced by those regimes, as well as the fascist and Nazi, they all sort of, she felt that that the disease or virus spread only when you get what she considers a mass society. Mass societies, you have millions and millions of hordes of people that don't feel, not only that they are unemployed, because they could be employed and still feel meaningless or feel, all that. I went on and on because that's all the stuff, before we get to this text, we've got to deal with Hannah Arendt's ideas. And that was one of her powerful, powerful ideas with which I have some modicum of agreement. Don't agree with all of it. I certainly don't agree with Arendt about liberal democracy, because I am a liberal Democrat, lowercase. And that's a whole other question. Again, we're going to have to get into my personal politics, inevitably, as we go throughout the show. The other thing I want to say about Hannah Arendt is that she not only was she really educated, she knew all the major players in intellectual thought. So she was Walter Benjamin, Rosa Luxemburg. So there's this kind of Bertolt Brecht, part of it is that they were German, those folks were German. So when Hannah Arendt criticizes Marxism, which she does in The Human Condition, when she calls into question Marx's privileging of work or issues about what labor theory of value. When she does that, she does it from a position or perspective of experience and knowledge and comprehension, because you can have knowledge and also wisdom, but also experience, because these Marxists were friends of hers, some of them. And so when we read Origins of Totalitarianism, I'm reading this text and I'm sensitive to all of these. I'm thinking, well, she kind of knows people who knows people. I mean, she's, she's escapes the death camp. She escapes the concentration camps and flees to the United States. And yet, when she was a student, who was her mentor and teacher? Martin Heidegger. And lover. And, I'm so sorry that I lost my copy of the Martin Heidegger, Hannah Arendt letters. There's a whole, thing about that. I just recently was so happy to get this. These are the Hannah Arendt Mary McCarthy letters. And if you notice the years here, 1949 to 1975, it's a lot of years. So Hannah Arendt knew somebody, was a lover, and had a deep relationship with somebody, her teacher, who himself fell prey, was seduced by Nazism. Heidegger. So when she writes about something, she writes about it with it's like she knows a lot the motives of people. So I take Richard Bernstein's point very seriously, that she underestimated Eichmann's commitment to being anti-Jews per se, against, the Jewish people. And that's a major source, again, that almost ruined her career in life when she wrote Eichmann in Jerusalem, because she's painting the portrait of Adolf Eichmann as just a rule follower. That's the banality part, right? The banality. I'm just following rules. I'm emotionless. I'm just, Hitler told me to do this, this kind of image. That's, of course, not entirely accurate, because he was a believer in Nazism. And of course, there's a movie that I unfortunately have not seen yet, that came out, an Israeli film that came out last year, uncovering some of these horrors of Eichmann's mindset and all that. And so there's all that in the backdrop, and I have to mention all that here, even though these are very difficult subjects, and they're. But she says that's why I wanted to write a book on thinking. I went to this trial. Here's what she says. Behind that phrase, banality of evil, I held no thesis or doctrine, although I was dimly aware of the fact that it went counter to our tradition of thought, literary, theological, or philosophic, about the phenomenon of evil. And then this is a wonderful passage. You're going to brace yourself for this. This is what I love about Arendt. There's an entire paragraph where she name checks all of her knowledge, but she's not showing off. It's like, these are things that, she wrote a PhD. Look, she wrote a PhD on Augustine and love, another great text, and she wrote it as an active political actives at that time for the Zionism of that era, which again, 20s, and she's not writing as a Christian. It's not a Christian. I mean, a lot of this book, we're going to find out she's a fierce critic of Christianity and goes on, and we'll get to that. Just as she was a fierce critic of aspects of political Judaism, and all that. But anyhow, I don't want to get too far ahead, but this is an example of her showing her learning. And so she's going to give a list of all the ways we think about evil. And here we go. You ready? Evil, we have learned, is something demonic. Its incarnation is Satan. A lightning fall from heaven, Luke 10:18, that's from the Bible. Lightning fall from heaven. Or Lucifer, the fallen angel. The devil is an angel too. Unamuno, whose sin is pride, in quotes, proud as Lucifer. Namely, that superbia, that's S-U-P-E-R-B-I-A, superbia, of which only the best are capable. They don't want to serve God, but to be like him. So it's, a lot of fundamentalist Christians today are very fond of, trotting that out of like, don't do this or do that because you're making yourself, humans aren't supposed to be in charge and all that. That's sort of one example of that. Evil men, we are told, act out of envy. That's Arendt dealing with the psychology theories, therapists and psychologists. This is fear that caused you to do this. This is your heartbreak that caused you to do this. This is you're envious, right? Envy. This may be resentment at not having turned out well through no fault of their own. Richard III, Shakespeare. Or the envy of Cain, who slew Abel because, quote, the Lord had regard for Abel and his offering, but for Cain and his offering he had no regard, unquote. Or they may be prompted by weakness, Macbeth. Arendt loved Macbeth and wrote a lot, I should say, on Macbeth. I mean, wish I could bring all these texts in here now. I can't, but or on the contrary, by the powerful hatred wickedness feels for sheer goodness. And her example is Iago's, quote, I hate the more, my cause is hearted, unquote. Claggart's hatred for Billy Budd's barbarian innocence. So she goes to Melville. She's read Billy Budd. And in Melville's words, quote, a depravity according to nature, unquote. Or by covetousness, the root of all evil, quote, unquote. These are all kind of quotes. Period. Like that passage, that's Arendt showing her chops, in a way. She goes on. However, what I was confronted with was utterly different and still undeniably factual. I was struck by a manifest shallowness in the doer that made it impossible to trace the uncontestable evil of his deeds to any deeper level of roots or motives. The deeds were monstrous, but the doer, at least the very effective one, now on trial, was quite ordinary, commonplace, and neither demonic nor monstrous. There was no sign in him of firm ideological convictions or of specific evil motives, and the only notable characteristic one could detect in his past behavior, as well as in his behavior during the trial and throughout the pre-trial police examination, was something entirely negative It was not stupidity, but thoughtlessness. And thoughtlessness is italicized in her text. Not thinking. And now we come to the essence and theme of these books of this series we're going to get. What is it to think? Is thinking merely just stuff in the head? Or rather, is it, as Arendt will try to explicate in these texts, in this wonderful text that we're so blessed and honored to be able to sit with her and think with her, is thinking something a little more specific than that? Could a lot of thought not be thought at all? And so I guess she's trying to get at, and again, you see a pattern here in the human condition. She says, work is not labor, is not action. Those are three separate things. Is that? In this text, she's going to say, thinking is not willing, is not judging. They're activities of the mind, but they're. So she's going to get into what thinking is. And she makes a charge that Eichmann didn't think, was thoughtless. Let's sit with that for a while. I'm going to get a drink of coffee here. Thoughtlessness. I'm going to skip some of this. Again, we're not going to do a traditional close reading. We're not going to spend 10 episodes of we'll just do for the purposes of this series. So, cliches, stock phrases, adherence to conventional standardized codes of expression, and conduct have the socially recognized function of protecting us against reality. That is, against the claim on our thinking attention, against the claim on our thinking attention that all events and facts make by virtue of their existence. If we were responsive to this claim all the time, we would soon be exhausted. So she's saying we got to be chill. We don't want to monitor ourselves in the world. We need defenses against, T.S. Eliot, humans cannot bear too much reality. I'm sure she knows that poem and was thinking of that, like in that earlier section when she's trying out Shakespeare and Billy Budd and Melville, et cetera, right? And so on. I think there's a trend now among some political philosophers to defend hypocrisy or selective necessity of certain kinds of hypocrisies. We can't all be all good all the time. And this, of course, raises questions about private life, how much of our private life should be exposed, how much should we be judged in public by what we do in private. And, of course, these are always contested things. And but that's all kind of what's behind that little passage there. Those kinds of things, right? But she says Eichmann differed from the rest of us only, and that he clearly knew of no such claim at all. It was this absence of thinking, which is so ordinary experience in our everyday life, where we have hardly the time, let alone the inclination to stop and think, that awakened my interest. And she italicized stop, like stop. There's a little bit, and this is very important. If you're following along, you'll say, well, is Hannah Arendt speaking like a grandmother or a mother? She herself was not a parent. She never had kids of her own. But what I'm saying metaphorically, you know how a mom says, don't touch that stove? The expression think twice. Sometimes in very simple, childlike moral lessons, people will say think twice or stop and think. Don't touch that stove. I don't know, what's some other examples? Count to 10. So all of these homilies or these bromides are actually kind of what Arendt thinks thinking actually is. So she's like your grandmother or mother saying, keep that to yourself. Don't say that. Might hurt, think it and don't say it, or think twice before you act. That's interesting, right? So it's actually something very, again, very general. She's writing for the general reader. And so she's saying that these general things are good, these things that are taught in families, if they're taught in families. That's a whole other discussion, of course, if anybody is teaching anybody to stop and think or whatever, right? But you take her point, take my point here. And so that's kind of the, and then she launches into all these wonderful rhetorical questions. Again, very general questions. Is evil doing, the sins of omission as well as the sins of commission, possible in default of not just base motives, as the law calls them, but of any motives whatever, of any particular prompting of interest or volition? Is wickedness, however we may define it, this being, quote, determined to prove a villain, unquote? That's Shakespeare, right? Determined to prove a villain. Isn't that Iago and Othello? I don't know. Shakespearean's here. Might the problem of good and evil, our faculty for telling right for wrong, be connected with our faculty of thought? To be sure, not in the sense that thinking would ever be able to produce the good deed as its result, as though virtue could be taught. That's in quotes, as though virtue could be taught and learned. Only habits and customs can be taught, and we know only too well the alarming speed with which they are unlearned and forgotten when new circumstances demand a change in manners and patterns of behavior. And then she goes on to bring in some of her erudition here in her classical training. She says, the fact that we usually treat matters of good and evil in courses in morals, quote, or quote unquote ethics, may indicate how little we know about them. She's already taking a dig at, moral and ethical philosophy in that passage. She's already saying, the fact that we teach these things show that we don't know what the things are. This is the severe, I don't want to say, this is the comprehensiveness of Arendt in that passage, right? That's kind of what she's doing, right? Morals comes from mores, or more, and ethics from ethos, the Latin and the Greek words for customs and habit. The Latin word being associated with rules of behavior, the speed limit, don't steal, rules of behavior. Whereas the Greek, so if Latin is rules of behavior, the Latin word, the Greek word is derived from habitat, like our habits, quote unquote. And I'm going to go skip a little here. So you see what she's doing. We're only on page 3. It's almost 1 p.m. So this is, again, I'm trying to, I think your text, let me just say, I think she deserves, I think she's deserving of us doing this. I really do. And it's exciting, right? So, that's what I'll say. Because you come into things like this. So let's see here. She says something about the word conscience. Sometimes people get a little bit in English language confused about conscience, consciousness. I am conscious that this cup is here. My conscience troubled me. You know, should I do that or not? You know, these very important etymological kinds of matters, right? The very word conscience, at any rate, points in this direction, insofar as it means to know with and by myself, a kind of knowledge that is actualized in every thinking process. So she's getting closer to her thing I talked about earlier, the grandmother and the mother teaching the child, you know, developing and cultivating conscience, consciousness. Or we have consciousness, right? So, so she goes on to say, so is this Eichmann trial that was the first cause or prompt to her interest in the subject. But then she says, second, what's the second thing? She says, second, those moral questions arising from factual experience and going counter to the wisdom of the ages, not only to the various traditional answers that ethics, a branch of philosophy, has offered to the problem of evil, but also to the much larger answers that philosophy has ready, at the ready, right? Has ready for the much less urgent question, what is thinking? Were apt to renew in me certain doubts that had been plaguing me ever since I had finished the study of what my publisher wisely called the human condition, but which I had intended more modestly as an inquiry into, comes her favorite phrase, quote, the vita activa. That's V-I-T-A, capital A-C-T-I-V-A, viva activa. I had been concerned with the problem of action. Action's capitalized, like those other words are kept. Action. Let's take action, right? Action. The oldest concern of political theory, and what had always troubled me about it, about action, right, was the very term I adopted from my reflection on the matter, namely vita activa, was coined by men who were devoted to the contemplative way of life and who looked upon all kinds of being alive from that perspective. So who does she have in mind? Well, people like Augustine, people like Socrates, Aquinas, when he was more innocently just thinking in his study and not being I won't, and so on and so on. So these were people that believe, monks, spiritual, metaphysical, religious. They're being contemplated. We're going to contemplate. We're not going to act in the world. So already she's bringing up this matter of the world and worldliness, as opposed to, in her very, very necessary binary, by the way, in this sense, worldlessness, which she attributes largely to a mistake in Christianity. She charges Christianity with privileging worldlessness, being against beauty, being against consumer items, being against appearances. Hannah Arendt, and as we'll get to in future episodes, is going to try to get us to approve and take seriously appearances, showing up in the public sphere. And our next episode is just going to be about that very topic, because the first chapter in this text is that we appear. And even in the Bible, of course, I forget which, it says, after all, they appeared, or somebody, or, that the world appeared to Adam and Eve, right? The world appeared to them. And you could say it was beautiful, you could say it was lovely, or you could say it was mysterious, or you could say it was awe-inspiring. You could say so many things about the appearance, but it's actually a fact the world does appear. And in a very real sense, this book and this series is going to be about our negotiation with what to do with appearing, whether we appear ourselves or whether others appear, and how are we to think about it? And Hannah Arendt knows her stuff. She knows her Augustine. She knows what folks have thought. And so if we may be permitted to accompany her on necessary critiques of those things she knows, or challenges to it, if we want to accompany her on this aesthetic journey of her text, Life of the Mind, we may find that we may possibly want to rethink things ourselves now, today, and into the future, and not necessarily look at things the way we did 10 years ago, 20 years ago, 30 years ago, 40, 50, 60, 70, 80, 90 years ago. If we have a 90 years ago, if we're at the end, then we may want to be open to, open to what? To actually thinking. And so with that, I conclude the first episode of Hannah Arendt and Mary McCarthy, if I can put it that way, Mary McCarthy's Life of the Mind. And I look forward to joining you for episode 2 of this book series. And we have a lot of really, really interesting shows coming up. Some of them will be surprises. Mark Antony Mendez is the next sort of really, really beautiful episode. That I believe that's next week. Of course, it's Valentine's Day. Of course, I'm doing a concert next week on the 16th with the trio in this very living room. So there's a lot going on, and I hope you can accompany us on these events, and I look forward to them. So thank you, and have a good rest of the week.